Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on freedom, populism, and big tech with our special guest, Bryan Caplan. Our program this evening is the third of a spring term series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of America after Trump. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the spring series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, as always, very special thanks go to the Institute staff, Assistant Director Eric Grell, Administrative Assistant Linda Carlson, and Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, and to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollering, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications. Thanks to St. Olaf professors Colin Harris, Jason Marsh, and Justin Merritt for consultation on substantive matters. And thanks finally to St. Olaf faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the public affairs conversation supported by the Institute, but also participants in St. Olaf economics and media studies courses. To remind our virtual audience members, you're invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us as our guest tonight Bryan Caplan, professor of economics at George Mason University and New York Times best-selling author. His book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, was named by Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times as the best political book in the year in 2007. Among Caplan's other publications are three books: Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, The Case Against Education, and Open Borders, co-authored with Zach Weinersmith. Caplan is currently working on a book entitled Poverty, Who is to Blame? He also writes for EconLog. He is published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, Atlantic, American Economic Review, Economic Journal, Journal of Law and Economics and Intelligence, and has appeared on ABC, BBC, Fox News, MSNBC, and C-SPAN. Bryan Caplan identifies as a libertarian and an anarchist of sorts, specifically an anarcho-capitalist, which is to be distinguished in his view from a left-wing anarchist. It's important to keep that distinction in mind. He is a libertarian anarchist. I expect those identifications might be apparent in certain moments of our conversation tonight. There is much more that we could say about our distinguished guest, but for now, Bryan Caplan, welcome. We're so pleased to have you with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Edmund. And I'm going to do everything that I can to have this not be another boring Zoom or whatever the software we're using meeting is. So I'm going to try. I know it's tough, but I'm going to do my very absolute best.
I expect that you will, and you will do it very well. Thank you. Bryan, again, our event tonight is about freedom, populism, and big tech, part of our spring series on America after Trump. Our specific point of departure this evening is that moment on January 8th, 2021, when Twitter permanently suspended Trump's Twitter account, charging that his tweets, and I quote now from Twitter, were highly likely to encourage and inspire people to replicate the criminal acts that took place at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021, end of quotation. Twitter's actions followed similar actions by Facebook and other social media companies that more or less limited Trump on those platforms. The impact of Twitter's actions was increased when a number of companies, including Apple, Amazon, and Google, discontinued their technical support of Parler, a competitor of Twitter's and a possible alternative for Trump, though now Apple has apparently reestablished its support of Parler. Anyway, critics argue that the suspension of Trump amounts to a suppression of political speech by a corporate power, which is democratically accountable to no one. This criticism is sometimes cast as a populist critique of the excessive power of a privileged elite corporate class. In this populist account, It's argued that for the sake of democracy and political freedom and freedom of speech, the government should take action. Either antitrust action, break up the social media and other big tech monopolies or oligopolies, or impose other constraints on them to limit or regulate their power. But free market defenders of Twitter have argued in response that Twitter is a private company, that its products are its private property to dispose of as Twitter sees fit. No one, according to this free market argument, has a right to use Twitter or any other social media platform without the owner's permission, not even Donald Trump as president. Moreover, free market advocates propose, no surprise, that free market competition is the best way to deal with corporate power, if it even has to deal with corporate power at all. After all, the market will generate, according to this view, alternatives to Twitter like Parler, if that's what consumers want. And if consumers don't want alternatives and prefer the efficiencies and productivities of social media monopolies or oligopolies like Twitter and Facebook, then that's just fine, according to free market advocates. Still, there are analysts who continue to speak of the actions of Twitter and Facebook as instances of America's new corporate tyranny. That's a phrase of Michael Lynn's, by the way. A tyranny imposed by big tech in alliance, so the argument goes, with other powerful agents of an alleged elite liberal culture. For example, the press, TV news, Hollywood, the Academy, the Democratic Party, all working together with big tech, presumably, to suppress the political freedoms of ordinary people or their representatives. So in this account, there needs to be limits on the power of big tech. And just last few points. In a recent Supreme Court ruling, conservative Justice Clarence Thomas suggested that big tech, social media companies, might be designated common carriers or places of public accommodation subject to public regulation. Others proposed that the companies should be designated public utilities, like electric companies, with all the possibilities of government regulation that comes with that designation. Or again, some have proposed antitrust action, break up the companies. Anyway, much more to be said, but we want to hear Bryan Caplan's thoughts on the matter. Bryan, you are a libertarian. Libertarians are freedom advocates. You've also been critical of populist critiques of corporate power. So tell us what you think, Bryan, about Twitter, Trump, the power of big tech generally, freedom, and the populist critique of elitist big tech corporate tyranny.
All right. So I guess I would just start by saying that one of my main causes is trying to suppress hyperbole to get people to calm down and speak in a measured way. So when people start talking about a website as having some immense power, I just think that's just such an odd thing to say. I mean, like if you were to go and say 50 years ago, like a newspaper has enormous power, it's like, well, they can go and print some words that you don't like. They can refuse to go and run what it is that you want to write to them. But what else is there? Otherwise, there's just people forcing people to go and promote views that they disagree with. So, I mean, I would say that if you just go and compare the media situation that we have right now to what existed 50 years ago, so, I mean, 50 years ago, typically you just would have had a lot of local monopolies at the level of individual cities, where there would be a few newspapers for each city. There was very little in the way of national newspapers. So if you were to go and say that today we have horrible tyranny, there's horrible tyranny probably worse 50 years ago. Now the actual number of options is so vast, it really doesn't come down even to how many options is it that, or how many options do you have? It's obvious that everyone has an enormous number of options. It's, well, do I have any really good options? It's not enough that I can speak my mind to people that actually are interested in hearing about it. I have to be able to speak my mind to the big audience, which you'll see on the most convenient kinds of social media. So anyway, I do think that these claims about tyranny and so on are just so overblown. And again, if you were just to go and compare the kinds of negative actions that you'll get from social media companies to any actual harsh punishment, right? To say how many days in jail would you do to avoid being kicked off of Twitter, right? It's like, I don't know, maybe a day, maybe not even that. So I think there is this hyperbolic overreaction. I mean, what I thought was striking about your discussion is that I think there's actually criticism of big tech on both sides. So in fact, I would say there's probably been more left-wing criticism of social media for failing to suppress right? So there's a lot of complaining about Facebook for having allowed right-wingers to go and make use of social media, and left-wingers complaining that they failed to go and act responsibly. And then there's also, of course, right-wing complaints about people being canceled and so on. In the case of Trump on January 8th, that's one where I would say that it would be very reasonable to at least say that Twitter is acting irresponsibly by not going and taking Trump off, because it really was very plausible to interpret what he was saying as incitement to riot. So whatever your view on the permissibility of incitement to riot, for someone to say, I don't want to be part of this, then I'm not going to try to to go and boost the signal of incitement to riot, seems very reasonable. Now, all this has to be distinguished between, there's defending the right of social media companies to do what they're doing and saying that they're doing a good job. So I'll definitely stand up for the right to do what they're doing. And I do think most of the complaints are, again, overblown. There are plenty of specific cases where I disagree with what companies are doing. But again, there I think of it as just like in the rest of life. When you're dealing with someone and you disagree with what they're doing, you can either, you can say, you can complain to them and say, I don't appreciate how you're doing it. You can take your business elsewhere, or you can just suck it up, right? We use all three of these options in normal life. So as to why these three options are not sufficient, right? And again, when you just start thinking about what it would mean for government to go and regulate these utilities and so on, it does come down to having state-run media, right? So the idea that you're going to get more freedom of speech or more opportunity for regular people to speak their minds with state-run media is so contrary to history. I'm pretty puzzled by it. So anyway, those are my main general thoughts. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. Generally speaking, libertarians like you seem to be more worried about government power and coercion than they are about private corporate power. Why is that exactly?
Well, let's see. There's the practical matter of how many millions of people have private corporations killed, right? Governments have actually killed many millions of people, right? There's what governments can actually do to you if they aren't happy with you, right? So governments really will kill you, put you in jail, right? Even democratic governments, if you get on the wrong side, they really can do terrible things to you. And for private companies, normally the worst you get out of them is they don't want to do business with you anymore. So again, I would say, by the way, that my general view actually is that I don't like to talk about my general view. I'd rather talk about the specific issue, because I'd say individual issues are so complicated in themselves, it isn't really very helpful to say, here is my whole general philosophy. So, this is a case where I would just say, what is the worst thing a business has ever done to you? Right? Really, I would just say, it racked my brain, what is the worst thing? I guess the worst thing that a business did to me this last year was my PayPal account was hacked, and I was charged $259 for a product that I didn't want. And then when I tried complaining, PayPal software made it very difficult, or in fact, made it impossible for me to complain until after the transaction went through. And then finally and then it took them a week to go and give me the money back. And that's the worst thing they did to me. I would say that multiple levels of government of the U.S. have done much worse things to me this year. And I think that if you just put ideology aside, this is almost everyone's experience. So while there's a lot of anger against business in terms of what is it that they've really done to you, as a consumer, I would say it's very hard to have any kind of real complaint against American business. If you go into a Costco and buy something, and then you just to change your mind, I don't like it, you bring it back to them and they say, is there anything wrong with it? No, I don't like it. And they say, okay, fine, here's some virtually unsaleable stuff that you're giving me, and here's your money back. That is a pretty typical experience with business. On the other hand, if you're not happy with government, what really can you do? You can go and call up the IRS and say, hey, I'm not happy with the services I'm getting for this money. What will you do for me there? And see how far that gets you. Right. So, of course, this year we've had a nice illustration of public schools taking all the tax dollars and then not delivering education for the year. Right. So instead, you get Zoom education, which is basically worthless for at least younger kids, does not provide the vital service of daycare that people actually were paying for. And is there any apology or anything else? No. It's like we take your money and then we give you what we feel like giving you. And if you don't like it, too bad. You can keep paying your money and love it or leave it. But either way, you're paying us. So, again, I would just say if you just put ideology aside and just focus on what kind of treatment do you get from business versus government, the treatment the business gives you is much better. I have trouble understanding how someone would disagree. If I were going to go and complain about business, I would focus not on how they treat me as a consumer, which is almost always awesome. Focus on how they treat you as a worker, right? That's where I can much more understand why people would be unhappy, because, of course, employers often will go and tell you to do things that you don't want to do as part of a job. Right, and of course, especially during a time of business downturn, you may feel like you don't have any very good options at the very moment, so you sort of have to suck it up at least for a while. Although even there, I'd say, well, you can have a long run plan to go and find a better job. It may not be viable immediately, but advice that I often give to students when they say, what am I to do in the face of this enormous corporate power over me as a worker? And I say, well, there's something called the first law of wing walking that says, don't let go of what you're holding on to until you're holding on to something else. So yeah, whatever job you've got, stick to that, and then keep your eyes peeled for something that is more appealing to you. And again, this is a strategy that doesn't solve your problems overnight, but it's a totally realistic strategy that has been used by most people in our society to improve their situation. So the main thing about people's jobs is that the money that they're getting is crucial for their lives. People are very focused on money, and I think the main way to understand the way that business treats you is that most people are willing to go and swallow a lot of their pride in order to get more money. There are plenty of jobs that you can take where you earn a lot less money, and then you have much more autonomy. But again, very few people are actually very interested in those jobs, probably because the money is something that, while people don't want to admit how important it is to them, they actually do care a lot.
So I hesitate to ask this now because it may be another general question that you don't want to explore. But
no, I'm happy to.
You don't see any potential problem in the power of big tech to control a conversation as being in league with, say, a particular party or point of view that might get in the way somehow of the political process of democratic discursive exchange and argument and debate or anything like that? You don't see a potential problem?
I see problems everywhere, actually. Everything is a potential problem. And the right way of dealing with this is not to lay awake at night saying, oh my God, there's another potential problem. What am I going to do? There's so many potential problems. The world's full of potential problems. See, the best thing to do is to look at what has happened in the past. So, what are the worst things that have ever happened in terms of private business being in conspiracy with a party to undermine democracy? If you go through the annals of history, I have no doubt that you will find some examples that will give you pause. And yet, in terms of what kind of a solution is it for government to go and start being the watchdog of the media? That's right. Say that is a recipe for the truly strong control. So, I would say that in the end, we're always choosing between evils, and I am much less worried about what private business is going to do. Again, I will say, I don't have a lot of illusions about what side the media is on. So I am very firmly of the view that the media has a very strong left-wing bias in the United States, probably gotten more pronounced over time. Of course, also academia has a notable left-wing bias. Right. And you could say, fine, let's go and have government go and take over the schools as well. Right. And exactly what you think that would do. So half the time there'd be a party that really wants to encourage the bias. And the other half of the time, there's going to be a party that complains about it. But as to what practical measure they would actually take is unclear. So, while I definitely think that there are a lot of problems with the way that discourse happens. Well, like I say, ultimately, the real problem with discourse is that consumers have values that I disagree with, right? Which if you were to go and say, why is it that Hollywood movies seem to be worse to me? Well, the obvious answer is my taste is falling out of favor, and Hollywood is now producing movies that make money with the audiences today, which is disappointing. But it's well, what am I supposed to do about this? Say that Hollywood has to go and make movies that I personally like? And how would that even if you could imagine trying to do something about that, just realizing you've created power that can be fall into the hands of anyone. And again, I think so much of what's going on with the media is that they are catering to their audience and telling them what they want to hear. Overall, I would say that almost all media is of appallingly low quality to me, whether left wing or right wing. like just because it's so emotional, so based upon hyperbole and trying to get people agitated about whatever they can. If you could just imagine a day when the news said nothing important happened today, go live your lives normally, it's a fine day, right? That'll never happen. They'll always find something to complain about. And if you change the channel from one kind of media to another, you can get a different story about what's terrible, but they are constantly trying to keep people in a state of paranoia and misery. And again, if you say, like, well, why do people want this stuff? I'll admit that I am so turned off by almost any form of news that I'm puzzled, but obviously I'm an unusual person. And most people, if you started going and telling them, well, like let's have another news story about how poverty is decreasing in India, most people would find that boring and wouldn't want to listen to it. And so what's happened is the media has the stories that actually people want to hear. I often encourage people, say, turn that news off. It's just making you miserable and is also confusing you and making you think the world is much worse than it is. And the number of people ever listen to me is very small. So I just say, oh, my values are unfortunately not shared widely. But it's not so much the system isn't working as that the people that are the consumers have corrupt views, which, again, I can try to go and improve, but not too much can be done about it.
All right, but it's one thing to talk about good and bad movies, the movies you like and so forth. It's another thing to talk about the possibility of impeding, in some sense, the political process. And I am a little surprised to hear you on the one hand say that you are concerned about the political proclivities of the media on the one hand and recognize in some sense the power of the media. But then that at the same time you wouldn't conjoin that observation with the sense that in order for a democracy to work, for free people to be self-governing, they need to have a kind of capacity for intellectual exchange, discursive exchange, argument, and so forth that might be jeopardized by a certain kind of media power. And you're not worried about that, it seems to me, in the way that you are worried about the public sector and government. And what I heard you say in response to that earlier was it has something to do with history, that historically you don't see the kind of problem coming from the private sector than you do the public sector. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah. So in particular, as soon as you start talking about government oversight of the media, what does that mean? It means state-controlled media. And what is state-controlled media going to do? It's going to go and support the government. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I see problems everywhere. Right? So there's no such thing as something where you cannot imagine problems coming out of it. I'm not happy with what with American media does, but if you were to say we've got to do something about it, to say, well, what are you proposing to do? There's going to be government oversight of the media that'll tell people what they're allowed to say. So. Or you're going to say, like, we're going to mandate balance, and what exactly is that going to mean, or even roughly what would it mean? So again, I think for most Democrats that means shutting down Fox News. That's their idea of government oversight. In terms of what conservatives would even imagine doing, I think there's too much non-Fox News for them to actually even seriously think about shutting it down. So I don't know what they would even really be imagining. They can talk about breaking it up, but if the real problem is just that consumers like the kinds of stuff that's being offered, then breaking it up is just going to give you smaller companies that are giving you a very similar monoculture. So again, where do you think that they'll be hiring the journalists from after the antitrust breakup? They'll still be the former employees of the companies that are there. They'll still have all the same biases they already do. Right. And again, so it's very much more tempting to go and say it's a problem of media power rather than with consumer preferences. But again, if you just imagine most people are like me, all the major media would just go bankrupt almost immediately because I would have I just can't stand most of what major media says. So it's not what kind of power do they have? They have the power that is given to them by people that do like the way that they're doing business and do want to watch their stuff. So again, of course, it's say, well, what do we do if the real problem is just the consumers have corrupt preferences? And I say, yeah, it's very hard to do anything about it. In particular, there's a catch-22 where if you think that the public has corrupt preferences, then how exactly in a democracy you're supposed to fix that? You got to go and convince the people with corrupt preferences that they're corrupt. If you could do that, you would already have solved the problem that way. So it really is something where I don't see anything the only kinds of changes people are proposing seem like they are not just unhelpful, they just seem counterproductive.
you talked about media control, government control of the media, but then you slipped from that into, or you moved from that into antitrust stuff. Your argument against antitrust is what exactly?
Right. So, well, of course, first of all, antitrust enforcement is always selective. So, if it's in the, if that's the government policy, they're not going to be applying it to all media companies equally. They're going to be singling ones out that they don't like and punishing them. That's very standard in the history of antitrust. And then, if you were to imagine even what would happen, so suppose you go and you take Facebook and you break it into 10 companies. All right, well, the people that are staffing Facebook would still be drawn from the original Facebook company. There's going to be 10 new companies. So they were serving a very similar market. So it's hard to understand why anyone would expect things to change very much. I mean, obviously, if you took the New York Times and broke it into 10 newspapers, do you really think they're going to be saying things that are very different from what they are today? The employees are just going to be drawn from the existing employees of the New York Times. So you can just get 10 smaller papers saying very similar things. So it really does come down to just the threat of the government that if you don't toe the line, we will go and start suing you. So again, it's not the same as government control directly, but it is the same kind of intimidation of media that we now see as standard for dictatorships and authoritarian regimes is, you better go and back us up or else you'll be on our bad list. And then who knows what we'll do to you. But we've got an immense range that we can deploy against you if we're so inclined.
So you are against any kind of antitrust activity on the part of government. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah. So, I would say that in the case of the media, I think it's particularly crazy. In the case of, other markets, there's at least a less crazy story saying that when you break up individual companies, this means that they will start competing with each other and this will tend to reduce prices. So it doesn't say that they'll all start offering a different kind of product. They'll offer the same product at better prices. So I'd say the textbook prediction of what would happen if you broke the New York Times up into 10 companies is that they would start charging lower advertising rates and probably also charge lower prices for subscribers. Although in this case, the product they're offering is so much worse when you break it into 10 companies that it's sort of a Pyrrhic victory. If we wanted to broaden this to antitrust in general, I have a lot of complaints about antitrust in general, but here, since it's just the media, I would say it's particularly a very poor tool for increasing the quality of dialogue in the media, both because it is a threat to hang over the heads of media that the government doesn't like, and then since they are supplying products that seem to be the ones that the market demands, it's hard to understand exactly why people even think the content would change if there were more companies.
So the idea that antitrust might lead to more parlors being generated and therefore some competition as far as that goes, that's a mistaken view in your view.
Yeah, probably. Again, so Parler has been doing pretty well, but it's not there's no sign it's going to become the next Facebook. By the way, on the day that everyone was complaining that Parler was being shut down, I went to my browser and went to the website and saw I could see it just fine. So it seems like the complaints that people were levying against places like Apple for dumping it looked greatly overblown to me. I think I was able to look at it right through my iPhone. So I didn't use the app, but as to why exactly that's such a big deal is hard to understand. So yeah, it seems like these again are like quite hyperbolic complaints. Right, and again, why exactly is that Parler is not rivaling Facebook? Because most people are not interested in the product that Parler has to offer. So when I heard the ideas, all right, I like this. Maybe this would be somewhat better. But again, I will say that I put controversial stuff on social media all the time. I never have the slightest bit of trouble with any social media company. So I am puzzled exactly with what the complaint is. So let's see if I ever had any problem with any social media company. No. So, I put up very controversial stuff and nothing ever happens to me. So I am puzzled by exactly what the complaint is supposed to be. Again, in the case of Trump on January 8th, that's one where it seems that it would be very reasonable to say that Twitter did the right thing by saying, look, it looks like you're inciting a riot and we're not going to help you to broadcast that signal. There is, of course, legally there actually is there are sanctions for inciting a riot. So I can understand why a company would not want to be involved in something like that, regardless of politics.
Okay, I want to explore now some deeper issues related to freedom and big tech.
Mm-hmm.
And here is a quotation from a piece by the philosopher John Gray entitled "The New Tech Totalitarianism." The piece is actually a review of a book by Shoshana Zuboff entitled "The Age of Surveillance Capitalism." And here's the quotation. I want to get your reaction to it. The prototypes of surveillance capitalism are Google and Facebook, which extract information from their users and deploy it to re-engineer their behavior for maximum profit. Human experience is raw material to be mined. Individual autonomy is usurped by ubiquitous monitoring with techniques of behavior modification, digging deep into what was once a private and subjective world. Personal experience is commodified and reshaped in the interests of capital. Whatever utopian claims may have been made for it as a force that emancipates individuals, this is a type of collectivism that subverts what has in the past been described as free will. And then just a couple of other sentences. Big data companies present the future as a new era of transparency and freedom. In fact, the endpoint of information capitalism is a social order that can only be described as totalitarian. Now, as a libertarian, Bryan, you're concerned about freedom. The concern expressed about surveillance capitalism by people like John Gray and Shoshana Zuboff is a concern about freedom. How do you, as a libertarian who is concerned about freedom, respond to their concerns?
Right. So I would just start by saying this is some of the most absurd hyperbole I've heard all year. Again, like if you just think about, what actually was totalitarianism, or like today, you can go to North Korea and experience it. It's like, how many minutes of North Korea would you endure in order to avoid all of these problems with the alleged totalitarianism of big tech? It's like, I wouldn't do 5 minutes in North Korea to solve these problems. And in fact, it is very easy for any individual to go and solve these problems. Just get off of social media. Just delete your account. It can be done in a few clicks. Plenty of people never signed up. Plenty of other people leave. So this is the absolute opposite of totalitarianism, where you can and just walk away anytime you feel like it. I do have to say that was one of the most awfully written paragraphs. So much passive voice was used. I would almost go and offer that paragraph to students in a writing class to teach them how to rewrite a paragraph in a non-awful way. But just aside from that writer's snark, as to what else we can say about that. You see, it's like, it's really terrible that a company is going and using my information to sell me stuff. It's like, so why would that upset you? I mean, in terms of the totalitarianism of it, it's like, well, so how many products have you ever bought based upon a Facebook ad? I'm going to say 0 for me. And I think that's probably a pretty normal experience. If they're engaged in totalitarian behavioral modification, they're obviously not very good at it. And as to how it's different from any other kind of advertising, other than making a greater effort to tailor the ads more directly to you, which, again, to my mind, is a plus. Right? I'd much rather go and see ads for a product that statistically I'm likely to be interested in, rather than just have to endure the normal lowest common denominator ads that you see on traditional media. Right? So, normally if I'm not in the market for a car, there's still a bunch of car ads, and it is quite unusual for social media to try to sell me a car. Of course, we don't buy anything that they're advertising, so that wouldn't much matter either. Right? So, I guess, my overall reaction is that there is a class of intellectuals that is looking for something to be upset about, right? And rather than going and looking over the world to find out what actually is really causing an enormous amount of harm, they try to find things that will get under people's skin and inflame their passions when you bring it up. And that's what's going on there, right? And if you were to go and talk about actual horrible problems on Earth, you could think about, nuclear war. What are the odds we're going to have a nuclear war this century, right? Well, if you think the probability of that is 2% or higher, why are we talking about any of this other stuff? How is this even on the agenda, right? And there's so much more serious issues, and then you realize, well, these are not intellectuals that are in the business of going and trying to figure out what are the most important issues and then convincing other people to care. They're in the business of finding out what people care about and then trying to go and agitate them. So it's, this is the kind of thing that when you hear it, you should be exerting a lot of self-control to realize I'm not going to let them go and put me in a panic over something so trivial.
Well, I have to say that your reaction to some degree surprises me because some of the mechanisms here for transforming human personalities or pushing persons in a particular direction are often associated with political totalitarianism. And so, for example, facial recognition and voice recognition, and the way in which that gets going to be connected with the Internet of Things and that sort of thing. So, for example, there's considerable concern expressed about what's going on in China with respect to the uses of these kinds of modes of pushing people in particular directions or controlling them or invading their privacies and that kind of thing. And so I would have thought that at least there would be a moment in a libertarian's thinking about this of anxiety. So to take one example, one of your colleagues, Tyler Cowen, in his book on big business, has a chapter on Is Big Tech Evil? And he expresses some worries about the Internet of Things and the way there's a kind of creeping surveillance that is part and parcel of this technology that at least should generate some initial worries, which he registers as initial worries, and he's a kind of libertarian himself. So what is the difference between your approach to these and his approach to these kinds of concerns?
So it's always hard to figure out what Tyler's position is, honestly. So I've been in great friends with him for 30 years. I'm often puzzled as to what his position really is. In terms of communist China, again, absolutely terrible. And this is just what happens when you put powerful technology in the hands of a awful government, right? So, but to go and look at China and say this shows that facial recognition is terrible, to me makes about as much sense as looking at the People's Liberation Daily, one of the main official Communist Party newspapers in China, and saying this shows that newspapers are evil. So look, the problem isn't the technology of the newspaper or the technology of facial recognition. It's putting it in the hands of a totalitarian government that runs massive slave labor camps, that puts people in jail for their political opinions. That's the thing to worry about. Right. And again, I would say, this is precisely the kind of thing people are getting distracted by. So if on every day on the news, there was another story about how there's millions of Uyghurs in slave labor camps in China, that would be a very reasonable thing to be talking about. And not just once a year. Oh, yeah, there's Uyghurs, but every day. Right. And also what can be done where say, how about let the Uyghurs leave China? Welcome the Uyghurs, say they're all welcome as political refugees and see whether China will let their people go. But in terms of facial recognition in the hands of, say, my iPhones in order to go and access it, this is the case where it's a technology in the hands of an organization I can fire at any time. So yeah, I'm not worried about them. And again, I just say what exactly is the past worry to be based on? Now, again, if you were to say when you see newspapers in a totalitarian country now that can manipulate public opinion, and shouldn't you then be worried about newspapers anywhere? I said, maybe a little bit, but remember, it's the combination of the media with a government monopoly, which is then backed up by the full might of a government that's totally willing to use whatever it needs to suppress dissent. That is the really scary problem. And on the other hand, in terms of what a newspaper in a free country has ever done to people, how many people have the newspapers in free countries put in slave labor camps, exactly how many people really would say I'm living in fear that there's going to be a knock at the door and something terrible is going to happen to me. I'd say not much. Now, so I have had friends who have been the subject of, so-called Twitter mobs. Again, of course, a large part of it is that they are active on social media, and furthermore, that they go and reply to people. So there have been a few times when people said, "Oh, Twitter's really angry at you," and I said, "Hey, I haven't checked." Right. So, and that was my remedy. Now, I would say, of course, that a lot of the reason why I personally am not worried about posting very controversial stuff is because I've got tenure. Right? If you don't know about this, professors have this special job for life status that we are sometimes capable of earning, and I've earned it. Even there, though, I would say that if you were to go and think about the world 50 years ago, you don't go into your office and start loudly announcing very controversial political views. You make enemies, and it makes people uncomfortable, right? It's long been normal for people when they are in their place of business to tone things down in order to get along with other people, right? Which again is a very understandable compromise that people have when they're trying to get along. Now, in terms of, there is a view that the workplace has started to come under a very similar kind of left-wing domination. And I've definitely seen this kind of thing, which I will say, is much more troubling to me than anything that I've seen on social media. Again, I think that so much of that, and when I say majority of it, really does come down to businesses ultimately are scared that they can be sued for discrimination if they simply don't stay with the times. Right, so I think this is another case where there are government regulations that are spreading and amplifying this climate of fear. So I'd say in particular, if a business could just loudly announce, like, we don't do political correctness here, and anyone who says that we are a discriminatory firm gets fired because that's slandering the firm. If firms could get away with that, I think that there would be at least a good number of firms that would do that. But given the current legal climate, that would be a great way to get sued. So I think that's why we do see the business being more monolithic than you would normally expect, is that there is, again, this threat of lawsuit hanging over their heads.
So you are concerned about this technology being in the hands of governments. That is a concern.
Yes.
You're less concerned, or not concerned at all, or not concerned much about these technologies being in the hands of private corporations. You don't have the same kinds of anxieties about that. What about collaboration between big tech and particular political parties?
Mm-hmm.
What about that?
Right. Yeah. So, of course, as long as political parties are officially private organizations that are not part of the government, and again, the only way to get around that is to have some kind of one-party state, then those companies are going to be able to go and hire businesses to go and work with them. So again, I don't really see any alternative to that. It's one where, on the one hand, I can understand why people are disturbed, and they say, well, look, it sure seems like big tech is working very closely with the Democratic Party. On the other hand, once you say that, it's like, all right, so what do you propose to do about it? The Democrats are definitely not going to want to do anything about that. And so then what would the alternative? Like when Republicans are in power, they're going to go and try to go after big tech and try to split them off from the Democrats. So what would that mean? Republicans will pass laws saying that political parties in general, or Democrats, wouldn't be able to go and hire big tech to help them. So, like any system of democracy, the political parties are going to go and hire businesses to help them out. So, it's one where, on the one hand, I can understand why people are troubled by it. Now, what I thought you were going to say is, what about big tech actually going and selling their services to, say, the North Korean government? Which I will say, is a lot worse, and I can definitely see the argument for not allowing it. Although, at least for the more advanced dictatorships, I don't see that it's going to make too much good. I think they'll just develop the technology on their own. Probably, maybe they'll be a few years behind the times, right? But even there, like if I were the dictator of North Korea, as to whether I would want to go and have a deal with Facebook or not. Say, on the one hand, I can go and get Facebook working for me. On the other hand, this is opening our country up to a bunch of foreign outside ideas that could undermine my rule. So, even there, I would say that if I were the dictator, I probably would not want to be dealing with foreign companies that would then open my country up, just at least by indirectly or in some inevitable sense. But yeah, I could definitely see people thinking that it's awful for companies to be selling facial recognition software to the Chinese government. So, like if someone wanted to say we're going to go and ban that, I would have no strong objection to it, other than, well, where's this going to end, and like how much difference will it really make?
Okay, now I think might be a good time to move to general Q&A from our audience. These are questions submitted online either beforehand or in real time. And now we have a first video question pre-recorded.
Hi, Mr. Caplan. My name is Luke Springer. I'm a sophomore history major here at St. Olaf, and I'm also involved in the public affairs conversation through the Institute. I wanted to ask you a question regarding your article entitled Historically Hollow, the cries of populism. You basically argue that activists against big business are wrong. They don't really have any points. They don't really say anything valid, because ultimately our lives have gotten better from big business. Amazon, Apple, they've improved our lives. You said Amazon is the best company out there. And the glaring question in my mind while reading that was the question of global warming and the climate. So from my perspective, I see a lot of these activists saying that we need to stop big companies from emitting. And we know that whatever 2/3, 70% or something of emissions come from these big companies. And we do know that global temperatures are rising, and we do know that that is going to make our lives worse. Global warming is going to affect us in a myriad of terrible ways. So I would just like to know how you respond to that critique of your argument that these companies are not in the long run making our lives better, and what you think about that sort of climate populism against big business.
Okay. Very interesting question. So like my first reaction would just be, I can say that a very large majority of complaints against business are wrong while still saying a few of them have a point. So that would be the first thing I would say. I'll still definitely stand by Amazon. I believe I said Amazon is the best store in human history. There's never been a better store ever made. In terms of the complicity of big business in global warming, say, like if you go and look at countries where the government has a much larger role, there's still very large contributions to global warming there. So communist China has a much larger role for the state, but they are, well, I think now actually the number one emitter. So it's not just a matter of business does it, it's a matter of, given the technology that we're using, it does do this. So what should we think about this? So a few things. So one is that you're going to say, like, are there any regulations that are actually going and preventing things from improving? And I would say there is one very large class of regulations, which is regulation of nuclear power. So there is a great deal of government persecution of nuclear power, which is the cleanest form of energy known to man. I'd say the arguments against the full use of nuclear power are very flimsy indeed. So again, just to say that it's the fault of business that we're using these fuels, I think is at least somewhat unfair. There's a big regulatory component as well. In terms of, again, what is the actual likely scenario? So think about it this way. So now I don't want to go and overstate your case. So we could definitely tone it down. But in terms of, suppose there is a lot of global warming with a show that we haven't actually benefited from business, I would still say I'd much rather take all the global warming we're going to get the next century and have the business we've had than just have been stuck where we were before. But again, that's not really the choice that we have. And there's, of course, the choice of using nuclear power, for example, which is totally viable. And I think if you talk to almost any scientist, they will say that nuclear power is greatly underrated, and really it is our lack of use of it is, and especially the heavy regulation of it, is based upon facts. It's based upon fear, not facts. It's based upon paranoia. So again, now, if we were to say, well, does that mean that nothing should be done about this at all? Again, the obvious thing is to start with, well, are there things the government has done in order to go and prevent things from improving? And I think that it has. And then once you're out of that and say, no, once we get rid of all the things the government is doing, we still have a really big problem. That's where I would say, all right, let's go and ask, well, what about the cost? My understanding is that there is a much cheaper alternative to just abandoning fossil fuels, even if we can't replace it with nuclear power, and that's something called geoengineering. There's a fair amount of research been done on this. It sure seems like it's way cheaper because unless you're going to do nuclear power, other alternatives to fossil fuels are, at least for the foreseeable future, just not viable. Again, that's not a full answer, but I think that's, again, it's about the best that I can do. And so your concern's a reasonable one. It's just a matter of what is a reasonable reaction. And again, I think the most reasonable reaction is nuclear power, and let's clear the way to using it, not just a little bit, but to replacing fossil fuels as much as we can. So, it seems like it's quite doable if we would just make a point of saying this is totally fine, and the complaints against it have just been wrong.
Thank you, Bryan. Next video question.
Hi, my question is that with the iPhone's new function in iOS 14.5 that users can actually click allow or not allow whether or not their personal data from an application could transfer to other applications or websites, would this be any effects on the big data industry, and how would it change that, given that a lot of people are using iPhones nowadays?
Yeah, so there's a problem with the fact that data can transfer easily from one device to another or from one app to another. Again, I don't think so. I mean, so like if all the companies that I do business with know about my purchases, I don't see that this is something that I could sensibly worry about. I mean, I think what I said in one of the pieces is if you just go back in time 20 years and try to explain to people what people are upset about now, it would be hard, right? This is not true for serious problems. If 20 years ago you went back in time and told them that we were going to have COVID, people would be like, oh my God, that's terrible, right? If you're 20 years now, you go back to saying, well, we'll have this problem, you'll have private data, and then it'll get shared between apps, and then a bunch of companies will know what you're buying. I think people 20 years ago would say, all right, and why is this something that I would lose even 1 second's worth of my life worrying about? So yeah, I mean, I don't see this as a serious problem. Again, of course, there is always this really does disturb you, then you can change your settings, or you can just not subscribe to services that go and share your data in ways that you find objectionable. When people say that's not practical, it's like, well, it's got to be more practical than what people did 20 years ago when they had 0 apps. So, you'd be back in the position of someone before this stuff existed. So I don't see that these are really very serious problems. They seem more like the kinds of problems that people start inventing when they've run out of actual serious problems. So, just imagine, there's someone who's got chronic pain, and then say you got to worry about your data protection. And it's like, I think I've got bigger problems. I got my back hurt. So why would I be worried about this thing? I do notice that it probably is younger people worry more about this stuff. And you tend to say, yeah, it's because you're young. You don't have any actual really serious problems. That's a little unfair, but nevertheless, there's also something to it.
Thank you, Bryan. Here's a question from our feed from Ashley Hodgson, who is the chair of economics at St. Olaf College. Excuse me. Common carrier laws intend to promote free market exchange for goods and services built on top of baseline services. These laws prohibit discriminating between customers by charging different prices or giving differential access. What non-big tech services warrant common carrier law protection? Are there any services within big tech that should be considered common carrier services?
Right. So I say that when you've got a government monopoly, then these common carrier rules make some sense. And otherwise, I would say that it's precisely the right of people to leave if they're not happy. That is one of the main reasons why competitors exist and why competitors come into existence. So the idea that companies are just itching to go and say there's a lot of customers we're not going to deal with anymore seems pretty paranoid. I don't see the business is interested in turning away any significant number of customers. So again, if you have something where the government has a monopoly over the water supply, then I can see why this makes sense. Again, it's because the government is the only organization that you can get it from. So that's, again, what I would be really worried about. So again, I would need to go over a list of all of the cases, and I will say I don't know the history of common carrier regulation in great detail. But yes, I do know that I am very skeptical about the normal story about the history of monopoly and antitrust in the U.S. as there were horrible problems and then the government fixed it. I say things were actually going great and improving very rapidly, and then some fearmongers saw an opportunity to go and terrify people with exaggerated stories and anecdotes, and then have a power grab. So that's my general view about antitrust, but don't have too much more to say about common carrier regulation specifically.
So on the antitrust thing, so it was a mistake to break up Standard Oil and all of that.
Oh yeah. So in case of Standard Oil, so first thing to understand about Standard Oil is they did not produce gasoline, which it was broken up before the automobile was widely used. They were suppliers of kerosene, so they're supplying lighting fluid. Right? They never had anything close to a monopoly on the actual oil. So they did max out at 90% of oil refining. During this whole time, though, the price of kerosene was plummeting. right? And seemed very much due to Rockefeller going and realizing great economies of scale, which he then, in a very competitive way, passed on to customers in order to expand his business. Now, by the time they were broken up, I think they'd fallen to about a market share of about 30%. So it was one where the market had taken care of whatever problem people were talking about long before Antitrust managed to do anything about it. So yeah, I think that Antitrust was basically scapegoated by some rabble-rousers who wanted attention and power. The most famous critic of Rockefeller, Ida Tarbell, I believe, had some close relatives who were competitors of Rockefeller. And while this does not show that what she's saying is wrong, it does mean that she should not be taken as a highly reliable source for anything about this. So anyway, the case of Standard Oil, I do know a bit about that case, and I think that was a ridiculous persecution of a fantastic company.
Thank you, Bryan. Next video question.
Hi, my name's Hans. I'm a sophomore majoring in economics. I'm asking this question on behalf of macroeconomics and contemporary issues. Alongside the stresses which accompany the pandemic, people are coping with anxiety by indulging their time in big tech companies such as Netflix or social media. Coinciding with the boost of entertainment, there's been an increase of consumers switching to DoorDash or buying groceries on Amazon to avoid contracting the virus. Therefore, if people continue this trend after the pandemic ends, how can this affect small businesses and restaurants that choose to remain open? Thank you.
Right. So, yeah, these competitors are bad for existing competitors. So, if you have an existing business and then a new business model comes along that people like, sure, it's bad for the firms that are already there. In terms of whether anything should be done about this, I would say no. Because the reason why consumers are switching is someone's got a better product. And that's the very heart of business, is you've got to make the customer happy, right? The customer's always right. So if you're losing out, this is a time to say, well, I've got to go and get with the times and find out what people are interested in. And maybe you can make that happen. Maybe you can't. So I thought you were going to be focusing on, isn't it terrible that people are going and spending so much time consuming things that make them miserable? Right. And I'm more sympathetic to that, actually. So while, this is a case where, as a libertarian, I'm not paternalistic, but only in the sense that I don't think that it's a good idea to do it. But not that, no one knows better than anyone else. I can definitely see people who spend a lot of time watching the news, and it's very hard to say that it makes them anything other than miserable. Or, another of my favorite examples is anytime I go to Las Vegas, I just look at the faces of the people in the casinos, and they're miserable. I don't see anyone having any fun in Las Vegas. So it's like, well, why do they do it? It's like, well, they're getting some kind of strange thrill out of it, but it's not happiness they're getting. And I would say that's very similar, at least for watching the news. And for some kinds of social media, it's probably similar. Again, this is where I would say the problem is not the business. The problem is the customers. The business are giving the customers what they want, but there are customers that act imprudently and don't really think about their long-run interests and have poor self-control. Right. And again, this is one where you can either go and scapegoat the businesses or say, well, people need to go and be more reflective about the best way to spend their time. And again, if you want to go and try to persuade people that this is not a very good use of their time and they're making themselves unhappy, that seems reasonable to me. I think the other is at least moderately compelling research that for at least for a lot of people, just ceasing using Facebook will make you feel better. So that's definitely something to consider. If that's true, then again, you don't need the government to do anything about it. Just stop doing the thing that makes you unhappy. It's really not that hard.
Thank you, Bryan. Here's a question now from our feed. Sam Bailey, class of 2021 from St. Olaf campus. You highlighted the potential for state-run media to have a negative effect on society. Authoritarian regimes like China are a good example. How do you feel about government support forms of media, the BBC in the UK or PBS and NPR in the US? These entities may not be fully state-run, but the entities rely on the government financially.
Yeah. So, again, I think so now there is the interesting case that in some of these countries, the government gives the money and then just sort of walks away. So again, you might think that Trump would have just tried to defund PBS. They all hate me, so why should I give them any money? I don't think he made any serious effort towards that. So it's not impossible for state-funded media to be independent, although normally the independence just means that there is one side that they're on and they push their line. So I guess the main thing I would say is what is the point of these companies, especially in the modern world when there are hundreds of other media outlets? What is the case for forcing taxpayers to support these? So like case like in a world of all the other media outlets, why does PBS go and get taxpayer support? So basically there's a fairly small number of people who like the kind of product that PBS has, and they get it paid for by the whole citizenry, even people that don't like it. So as to why that's especially fair or reasonable, and again as to what like you say, like PBS is raising the quality of politics in America. So well, you'd have to, I guess, agree with the politics PBS is pushing to think that. So I say this even though NPR is actually generally my favorite place to interview with in the media. So I will say by my standards, the quality is definitely higher, right? But again, a lot of that is because I'm a professor, so I like that kind of thing. But of course, I also appreciate most people don't like it, and as to why this thing that I like should be supported by the government and other things shouldn't, doesn't make much sense to me. I'm also a big opera fan, and yet if someone were to say, why should we have to subsidize your kind of music? My answer would be, yeah, it doesn't seem very fair. But as long as it's there, I'll go. But I'm not going to say that there's some great argument for why what I like is worthy of taxpayer support and other stuff doesn't get it.
Thank you, Bryan. Next video question.
Hi, my name is Wisla Chaila, and I'm a sophomore at St. Olaf, and I'm an econ major. My question today is, a few months ago, there was the whole Facebook and WhatsApp security concern. And even though a large number of people that I know still using the apps, there was the whole security privacy concern that happened. And in your article, you mentioned the unreliability of populists on tech. However, if these people could earn the trust of the general population and cause such an uproar, shouldn't they be given some sort of attention, even if it is just to watch over them, because they could easily cause damage due to the power of influence that they have? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll confess I did not follow that particular scandal. My default is that almost any scandal like this is just greatly overblown, and it's people who are trying to get attention and power by finding any small complaint and then harping on it. Is what else I can say about it. So should we infer from the fact that they get attention that they have something useful to say? No. But in a way, I would just say the best test of that is just to go and flip through a bunch of channels on the media and to see, do these people seem reasonable, fair-minded, well-informed, thoughtful? Say, practically defining trait of people that do get on mainstream media is that they are none of those things. They're there because they are demagogues who are riling people up and trying to go and inflame people's emotions. They are deeply innumerate people. If you say, so, this risk is roughly about as bad as what probability of nuclear war, they would just not respond to that question. And again, this is the kind of question that you should always be asking. In the broad scheme of things, is this 1/1,000,000th as bad as a nuclear war, 1/1,000,000,000th, 1/1,000,000,000th, 1/quintillionth as bad? And once you put numbers on it like that, say, gee, I don't think I should be thinking about things that are 1/quintillionth as bad as something that's actually a real problem. That seems like it should just be thrown into the basket of things that I will never think about for as long as I live. And anyone who tries to get me to talk about them is distracting me from more important things.
Thank you, Bryan. Another question from the feed from Ben Borchardt, sophomore class from St. Olaf College. You talked about media catering its content toward its audience, but how much of a role do you think media has played in causing a shift in public opinion, especially when it comes to the increasing popularity of progressive left ideology? What role has the media played?
Yeah, so that is a great question as to how much. So this is one where social scientists like me, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out cause and effect. So one story is that the media has become more progressive because the population has become more progressive. Another story is that the population is becoming more progressive because the media is becoming more progressive. Then, of course, there is the more general story of it's both going on, and then, well, what is the mixture of the two? So anyway, these are actually hard questions. Step one is realizing they're hard, and then step two is trying to figure out exactly what's going on. There was this big shift towards left-wing media before the 2016 election, and yet somehow Trump did manage to get elected, right? So I think that should at least give you more of an idea that a lot of the causation is not going from the media going and transforming the population. Rather the media is catering to its audience. So probably a lot of what's going on is actually just the aging of the audience, and also the kinds of people that are watching mainstream media are younger. The kinds of people that are watching Fox News and things like that are older. So I think that is probably a lot of what's going on. There is some research saying that if you look at randomized trials where some areas get some kind of media before others, this does lead to some moderate change in opinion. Although as to what the longer run effect is quite a bit less clear. So again, if, say, the media had been more moderate, would Trump have ever been elected in the first place? Or if the media had been more moderate, maybe there never would have been a Fox News, and then we would be having a very different discussion. So as to what the actual effect is, even for people that who like the agenda, it's just a lot less clear than it would seem. I guess in the end, I would think that probably the media is pushing people a little bit. Although, again, I would still say I think it's actually moderate compared to the threat of lawsuits, which I was alluding to earlier. So again, there's this puzzle about why is it that it's so hard to find any business that just says, look, we do not pander to left-wing fashions, right? And I think the best answer, again, you say, well, look, there'd be some companies like that. Why is it hard to find any company like that? I think the answer is any company that did that would be painting a giant target on their back saying, sue me, and sue me for a lot of money. And I think that's why there is so little diversity is lawsuits. Again, this doesn't mean that lawsuits explain everything. So I think there are plenty of sincerely left-wing businesses that would be doing this stuff even if there were no laws. But on the other hand, I think that there would be a lot more options if it weren't for the case that a side effect of discrimination laws is actually causing political discrimination of the kind that we've been seeing. Just a more general point. Right. So anytime you see a problem in the world, I would just say it's a good rule of thumb to say, well, could we reduce this problem by repealing some laws? Right. We've passed some laws in the books. They're definitely reducing people's freedom. That's at least something that should bother us. And then if we say, hey, we could go and take away some constraints on people, we could go and point fewer guns at people and also make a problem less severe in the process. That sounds like a great place to start. Right. And I'd say, I'd be a lot more sympathetic with activists in general if they would say, I start by first finding laws to repeal that are making this problem worse. And then I look and see how bad the problem is after all those laws are gone, and then maybe do something else on top of that. But of course, rarely do I see activists talk about repealing almost any law. It's almost all focused on let's pile on some more laws to go and possibly compensate for what we've already had. Which again just makes me think they're not really that serious about the problem, and it's more focused on, first of all, trying to get attention, and second of all, trying to exercise power over others.
Thank you, Bryan. Next video question.
Hey there. My name is Daniel. I'm a senior econ major here at St. Olaf, and I am studying this semester with Professor Bansa in his Contemporary Issues in Macroeconomics class. My question is, what is the best comparison to be drawn between something in the online space like Facebook, Twitter, or Reddit, or a Fox News comment section where users post their own content, and something in the physical world, something like a field where the owners assume minimal liability for what's said, or a book publisher where the owners have huge liability for the content in that's in those books, and thus regulate heavily what is published in their books? Is it something in between? Should Facebook and Twitter be compared to something else entirely different? Thank you.
All right. So I don't think it's true that book publishers are very heavily liable. So they have to worry about, they do have to worry about libel. Right. Other than that, publishers can put out books that give recipes for nuclear weapons, and if some terrorist uses the book to build a nuclear bomb, book publishers don't have any liability for something like that. So this is all part of general free speech protections, which actually do apply very broadly to everything from newspapers to television to books to comment sections. And I think there is a lot of wisdom in saying, look, even though a lot of what people say seems stupid and evil and asinine and dangerous, still comes down to, first of all, you're going to deprive people of their freedom to go and say things that are stupid, asinine, evil, and dangerous. Where does that end? And then secondly, what's the alternative? There's going to be a government regulator that decides what it is that people can write and say and think. So again, that one seems like a pretty awful result. So, if you say what is the closest similarity? I guess Let's see. So, you might think about it as being sort of like a public access station. Facebook's kind of like a public access station or something like that. Although probably most people on Facebook have more viewers than the typical public access station. I once did film a show at a public access station, saying, "Wow, like who on earth watches this?" I feel like I get more attention just from writing something on Facebook than appearing on this show. But anyway, I would say that like the exact analogy, it's you might say it's more similar to like the personals ads or something like that in the newspaper. But in the end, say like new technology, it's just different from anything that existed before. But it all falls under the heading of it's somebody going and helping someone else say what they feel like saying. So there is this narrow list of exceptions for free speech, which again are at least not crazy. So like libel and slander, like I'm not actually big fans of those laws, but they're not crazy. And then there's incitement to riot and a few other things. And once you're past that, the normal standard is say whatever you want to say. And like part of it is principled and like, look, it's just words. Just let the guy speak his mind. We can just ignore him if we want to. And then there's the pragmatic concern of, well, what are we going to do? So have the government decide what can be said and what can't be said.
I'd like to follow up on this, Bryan, because in this conversation about limits on big tech and all that sort of thing, some people have suggested there should be a repeal of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that exempts big tech companies from legal liabilities for libel, obscenity, copyright violations, and other such things. And so the repeal then, according to this proposal, would define big tech companies as publishers, and that the idea is that if social media companies want to curate their material, censor their material, say we're not going to publish Trump and so forth, as publishers do, then they should be subject to the same kinds of legal liabilities as publishers for libel, among other things. I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so in terms of what's likely to happen, I think it just means that dissident voices are going to be kicked off. So if you're worried about people being canceled, this seems like a perfect formula for getting a lot more people canceled. In terms of this being an exception, I'd say it would be better to do it the other way around and say that publishers and everybody else have the same immunities and say, look, all we're doing is printing the words that this person wrote. If you have a problem with it, go and talk to that person. This is not our problem. But again, so the key thing with social media, of course, is that precisely because the value of what people are doing is low, it's just something people do as a hobby in their spare time, a very moderate cost can easily just get people to stop doing it. Whereas book publishers, because they are actually selling a commercially viable product, they're probably going to stay in business despite the regulation. So there is a differential effect in terms of the negative consequences. So if you were to go and apply the book publishing rules to Facebook, then this could kill Facebook. It's not at all unreasonable, or at least it could mean that a lot of people get kicked off of Facebook, or sort of anyone with controversial views. So, would Facebook want the liability of having me around? Wouldn't surprise me if they'd say, no, we don't need that. So, but again, if you're worried about suppression of dissenting voices and uniformity, then this seems like exactly the opposite of what you should do. Again, probably what's really going on here is not that people seriously even want to repeal that. Rather, it's just another threat they're hanging over the heads of big tech to say, you better stop being so left-wing, right? So I think it's a lot like the threat of wielding antitrust and saying, hey, look, that's a nice business you got there. Hate to see anything happen to it. And then it's like, yeah, what could we do that would just destroy their business or greatly harm their business? But in terms of that seriously being what they want to do, I think it's pretty obvious that it would just mean that businesses wouldn't want to do business with dissenting voices anymore. So, if that's your goal, it's counterproductive. If you just want to go and have very bland mainstream media, which again, probably in practice is going to be bland mainstream left-wing media, then go ahead. That's probably what you're getting. Probably a good way of getting it.
Hey, thank you, Bryan. Here's a question from the feed now. Markian Romanician, class of 2023, from San Jose, Costa Rica. Throughout your remarks,
Hola, Costa Rica.
Throughout your remarks, you argued that businesses are not actors which we ought to go after or hold accountable, insofar as business decisions are only reflections of consumer preference. In reference to media bias, you argue that though you do not agree with the leanings of media today, consumer preference is beyond your or anyone's control. Assuming your assertion about the inherent validity of consumer preference holds, are you concerned by the fact that often consumers are not allowed to make informed decisions? For example, it is not in the interest of big business to disclose questionable environmental or child labor practices.
All right, so why don't I start at the end and then work back to the beginning? So to say that consumers aren't free to make an informed decision, I'd say you're very free. Go inform yourself if you're so curious. So, the reason why consumers are poorly informed is that they generally don't care. They're apathetic. Now, going back further, so I would not actually say consumer choices have inherent validity. A little unclear what that would mean, but just to say it sounds kind of like consumer choices are above criticism, and I criticize consumer choices all the time. So obviously not just within my family, although I would start there and say, why are you buying that? That stuff is terrible. Or why are you watching that show? That's a bad show. Main thing I would just say is for government to go and start trying to police the kinds of things that people are consuming. Again, first of all, it is a serious violation of freedom. And then secondly, pragmatically, what's really going to happen if you do that? You're just handing power to some other people, basically demagogues who are going to grandstand and try to get attention and power doing what they're doing. In terms of whether it's going to make anything better, it's hard to see how it would. Now, your point about the extent to which I'm exonerating business. So it does make me think of a hypothetical. So if there were, say, a company that offered hitman services, and then someone say, hey, it just reflects consumer choice, don't get mad at the hitmen, I would say, no, we can get mad at the hitmen. So they're doing something that is so obviously wrong, and they are accomplices in something that is deeply evil. So this is where it would be reasonable to actually criticize them. And like I said, I would definitely be very open to criticizing Western tech firms that would go and sell surveillance technology or barbed wire to communist China, right? And say, look, here you really are crossing the line from just selling a service to being complicit in serious human rights abuses. So again, don't want to say that it never makes sense to go and blame business, but still just in terms of understanding the correct story, right? It is, in general, people do not like blaming or criticizing consumers, even when it's true. And my point is just that it is very helpful for assessing the culpability of business to first get a clear idea about what the right story is, and to realize most of the time it's not the business wakes up in the morning and says, we have our agenda we're going to push, but rather it's consumers go and ask for stuff and business says, well, the customer is always right. Now, again, this does not justify being a hitman or running a hitman company. There are reasonable objections in extreme cases.
Thank you, Bryan. Next video question, please.
Hi, my name is Hannah Gilbertson. I am an econ major, and the question that we had was, should social media platforms be forced to pay users for selling their data? Like, for example, if Twitter were to take your data that you use from scrolling and then sell it to advertising agencies to sell your products.
Right. So this, again, is the kind of thing where you can say, should companies be forced to go and do anything for their customers, right? And you might say, well, yeah, precisely because they're in it for the money, they're not just going to give people stuff. But then you say, wait a second, internet companies especially give people stuff all the time. Almost all the stuff that you're using on the internet is actually supplied free of charge. So then the question is, they're giving us some stuff for free. In fact, they're giving us a ton of stuff for free. And then what exactly is it that they're entitled to get back? And again, I would say they're entitled to go and set the terms of use, which includes saying, look, this is using your data, right? Which again, the value of it is so small for any one person. The value of your data to any company is just pennies. So this would be, to say that companies have to go and pay you for your data would amount to saying like Twitter is to go and send you a check for 20 cents every year or something like that. What's valuable is not any one consumer's data. What's valuable is the data of tens of millions of people, which does add up in value. But again, this is a case where it's mostly just a threat that you're dangling over tech companies to say, if you keep making us mad, we're going to go and impose a regulation on you that will destroy your business model, right? So, I think this is a very bad idea. So, like the chance to use your data is one of the few things these companies are actually able to make money off of. Of course, probably advertising is a bigger one. Right now, again, you might say, well, shouldn't I get paid every time they advertise that they sell me to advertisers? Like, well, first of all, how do you think they're supposed to run their business unless they can make some money, right? And then there's the deeper point of, if the existing companies are not giving you a good deal, someone else can come along and say, fine, I will pay you for your data. Now, the fact that there's no companies around there that are they're talking about doing this is a pretty strong sign that it's just not a reasonable change in the business model, because what you have to offer, frankly, just is not worth very much. Like the information, the marginal information that they get from one more person is just a grain of sand. It's not worth very much. They wouldn't pay much for it.
Thank you, Bryan. Another question from the feed from Talia Williams, class of 2024, St. Olaf. You suggest that corporations have not caused much harm against consumers in comparison to governments, saying that they do not kill citizens like governments do. However, wouldn't climate change count among harms which business corporations have committed against consumers with deadly side effects in the long run? How does climate change and negative externalities produced by corporations in general impact this libertarian view? Thank you.
Yeah, so as I said, when I, in general, am skeptical of complaints about business, this doesn't mean that I'm skeptical of 100% of all complaints. So this is pretty similar to the previous global warming question, where, first of all, it's worth pointing out, this is not a complaint about business specifically. This is a complaint about any kind of institution in society that uses fossil fuels. And of course, governments all over the world do the same. So government is a much larger role in the Chinese economy, and they are, I'm almost sure, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. So again, this does not mean that businesses aren't doing something bad, but it's pointing out that it is not nothing unique to them. So I would say, well, why are you focusing on them instead of the technology? And then, okay, so anyway, that aside, then this question of, like, how much harm are we talking? So of course, it is well known and undeniable that corporations, they kill people all the time, in the sense that that FedEx has a fleet of cars, and some of those cars get into accidents, and some of those accidents leads to deaths. So, of course, the same goes for any of us that drive a car, statistically speaking. If we drive enough, eventually you're going to kill someone. Maybe you'd have to live 1,000 years, but it will happen, would happen if you went long enough. So there's a general, both legal and moral view that that when it's that low level, it's something that's regrettable, but it's not actually something evil, as long as you are acting in a reasonable way. Now, as to what the likely actual long-run harms of global warming are, so science can give us reasonable estimates about what will happen to the temperature. In terms of what the actual effect on human living standards is, on the other hand, that's something that economists have to focus on. For now, of course, we see that countries that have not modernized are much more deadly. They have much lower life expectancy, and things are much worse. So that's worth pointing out that for the time being, fossil fuels have been used very successfully to greatly enhance the quality of life and longevity and human health. Anytime there's a hospital that is running its generators with fossil fuels, or that is powered by fossil fuels, that's going on. So in terms of what the likely scenario is, so of course, if you push it far enough in the future, then it becomes hard to predict. Is it possible the business in the future is causing large amounts of deaths by continuing relying on fossil fuels? It's possible. Again, I don't think that it's likely. I wouldn't generally trust activists. I would say, well, let's calm down and think about what is the actual most likely scenario here, and what are the probabilities of different scenarios. And again, then finally, I would go back to, if fossil fuels are a problem, like, what are the alternatives? So we actually have a fantastic alternative that governments have largely made unavailable, which is nuclear power. So, and again, it is not, it is totally not the fault of business that nuclear power is illegal. And business would love to go and produce a bunch of nuclear power plants, but it's very hard to get permission to do that kind of thing. And then finally, like I said, there's the question of, if nuclear power is off the table, then what is the lowest cost way of dealing with this problem? And I don't have time to go into it, but geoengineering is a term worth Googling to go and get the basic case for it. It seems very promising, totally worthy of further research. Seems like it is a very cheap way of counteracting global warming without going and causing other serious economic costs. So definitely something to look into. But again, so if you just say, well, let's see, you're hard question. Suppose that business really is going and is the marginal factor that's going to lead to total disaster 100 years from now, are they responsible for that? And I'd say, yeah, sure, it's just a question of whether the scenario is actually reasonable and fair, and also what the alternative is.
Thank you, Bryan. Next video question, please.
Hi, my name is Ben Stile. I'm an econ major. And my question is, do firms' ownership over the marketplace, such as Apple's App Store, is that a threat to freedom and free and fair competition, which would in turn be best for the consumer?
Right. So I guess I'll say it's a very, very, very tiny threat. Right. So we can imagine a worst case scenario where something bad happens. But yeah, other than that, I think this is great hyperbole. So yeah, if you don't like Apple, there are other companies you can use. And that's the obvious decision. So take your business elsewhere if you don't like it. There are a lot of alternatives. So, and really to go after Apple is to deprive all the people that love Apple products of the fruits of free competition, which Apple is delivering. So again, it's easy to forget about those people, but they're there. And like I said, as to why a few complainers should go and take precedence over an enormous number of satisfied customers, I really don't know.
Thank you, Bryan. Another question from the feed. Second question from Sam Bailey, class of 2021 from campus. If you delete accounts, you can still be tracked. There are stories of Facebook creating shadow profiles for non-users by collecting data from non-users in two main ways, from their browsing history and from their friends. Private companies can still exploit non-users for profits. Is there a space and argument for government to limit the abilities of firms to do this?
Right. So I don't know exactly what the technology is. I mean, it almost sounds like Facebook is hacking you. I think there are actual hacking laws, which would be fine. Although, again, I would just say, what kind of a person has no bigger problems in their life that they would ever worry about this? It's like, gee, I could delete my Facebook account, but then I could be following my friends on Facebook, and then Facebook could be tracking me, and this is something that I worry about. I mean, I just have to say, there's such a great world of life out there, and so many opportunities and things you could be doing, and to go and waste your time worrying about problems like this that are so small and petty. I mean, again, I'm suspecting that you'll see. I didn't see a picture of the person answering. I'm suspecting this person is less than half my age, and I would just say, look, you are young. The world has incredible opportunities for you, and don't think about stuff like this. This is a very bad way to go and spend the minutes of your life. Like, try to do constructive and positive things and find things that you enjoy instead of this kind of paranoia about a company might be watching me in some way, even after I delete them. Like, even if it were true, who cares?
Thank you, Bryan. Another question from the feed from Leonardo Acerbi, class of a sophomore from St. Olaf. Do you think social media has made the pandemic situation worse?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. So towards the beginning of the pandemic, I was asking, suppose we didn't have the internet, would we still have locked down? And most people, I suspected, and most people I surveyed agreed that, yeah, without the internet, we would just have gone through this as if it was a normal historic pandemic where we just say, we'll take some minor precautions and a bunch of people are going to die, and then we'll just continue our lives. So I do think that the internet in general has probably made it a lot more feasible for people to engage in the drastic avoidance behaviors that we've seen. Definitely in terms of all the people who were teleworking, like, you couldn't have done this kind of telework even 20 years ago. Like, the technology was way too crummy. And, internet was still very buggy about then. So I think Edmund can attest to how things were then. If you're on a university machine, maybe most people didn't have internet connections at home that were anything good enough to work on. So it is plausible that at least the internet in general has led to this very strong reaction. Now, if you think that it was great that we had this very strong reaction and you think it prevented a lot of lives lost, then you should be really happy. On the other hand, if you think this was a gross overreaction, which I honestly do, then you should say, gee, I mean, the fact that we have this technology is what allowed this this paranoia to go and spiral out of control and bring us to this world where kids don't go to school for a year and people stop seeing their friends and family. And to my mind, this has been much worse than any deaths that would have happened in the absence of the more extreme measures. And I'm not saying that it wasn't a good idea to have some moderate precautions, but I think people went overboard by about a factor of 10 in terms of how cautious they've been, right? And like I say, yeah, well, like, wouldn't more people have died with less caution? Yeah, probably, but just not that many more. And quality of life matters along with quantity, right? And if I were very old myself, I would have taken extra precautions, but there's no way I would want to be isolated from friends and family. I'd say, look, I'm 80 years old. Like, I don't want to waste one of my last few remaining years being alone, right? So that's me. I've written elsewhere about what a reasonable estimate of cost and benefits here is. So, and I do think it's at least reasonable to say that the internet did wind up having this negative side effect. And of course, if you disagree with me on the response to the pandemic, that's another point in favor of the internet. So you got to give it that.
Thank you, Bryan. We've come now to the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this stimulating exchange with Professor of Economics at George Mason University and New York Times bestselling author, Bryan Caplan. And thanks so much to you, Bryan, for being with us and for sharing with us your views on freedom, populism, and big tech.
And thanks to everyone in the audience. You guys have been fantastic. The quality of the questions, very high. And furthermore, most of them are questions I haven't heard before. So I was just talking today about how even when most smart people aren't really very creative, and most people, when I listen to very smart people, I say, yeah, you're telling me a bunch of things and I've heard all of them before. Why aren't you more creative? And so anyway, this was a great pleasure to go and hear a bunch of questions that most of which I had not actually heard before. So I don't know what's going on at St. Olaf's College, but keep doing it.
Thank you, Bryan. This event tonight was the third and last in our series on America after Trump. This spring at St. Olaf College's Institute for Freedom and Community also continues its series of public events on the theme Diversity, Freedom, and Community. The next and final event in that series is on freedom, open inquiry in the Academy, with two prominent critics of the Academy, Helen Pluckrose and Alana Redstone, who claim that there is a lack of intellectual or viewpoint diversity in the Academy today. That event will be on May 11th. Learn more about these and other events at institute.stolaf.edu. That's institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can join us for these events. But for now, good night, be safe, and be well.